Hello, and welcome to the 11th and final installment of this Twitter integration video series. In this video, I'd like to revisit some of the modifications I made in previous videos and define a more uniform behavior for each row in the archive control. I'll revisit the archive provider and redefine each row entity and nav link hint as Twitter. After that, I'll revisit the somenu.configuration file and refactor the archive list definition of the friends subcontext. I'll rename it from friends to Twitter, and this will link each row to the entity string defined in the archive provider. This will ensure we see the same context menu for each row. The new menu definition will have more commands to execute new behaviors, such as this retweet capability. Then I'll revisit the SOArchive link info types.config file and define a single link info element for the click action. This should already be done, right? This is the update of the tweet current. We're updating the tweet ID as well as the tweet name. We'll also add a single link info element for a double click action so that when I double click any row, it opens a new tweet dialog for me. This is ready for me to submit a new tweet to Twitter. I'm going to change these three elements because for this application, every row is the same. It's not like they're documents, sales, or appointments. The rows don't require a unique set of actions or display different context menus. I only did that in previous videos to demonstrate that capability. After those changes, I'll add more buttons to the archive control toolbar, and I'll wire them up to their respective JavaScript actions. Lastly, I'll give you a quick tour of the data handler and show you how I handle the actions taken when the context menu or an archive control toolbar button is clicked. So let's move forward and finish this application. We have to have some base to get started from. So here we are in our application as we left it in video 10. We have a single add toolbar button that when we click it, it says add something. We have rows here that if I select a row that is of not type mentions or friends, I will not see a context menu. I'll just see this little white square. However, if I do click one of my own or one from a friend, I will get this context menu that says new, retweet, or get current, which will just give me the archive ID and the tweet IDs. So let's go ahead and switch over to Visual Studio and begin by changing the entity string and the nav link hint in the archive provider. So here in the archive provider is where we define the entity name string and also the nav link hint. So I'm going to change this to say the entity name equals Twitter. Now we have a constant already in this class called Twitter that we'll leverage. That's up here and is the provider name variable. So I'll go back down to add rows and I'll change this from entity to provider name, and I'll also do the same here for the nav link hint. So I'll change this from entity to provider name. Once that's done, I'll save those changes and rebuild the project, and that will redeploy the devnet.twitter library to the website's bin directory. Now let's switch over to the somenu configuration.config file and change our context menu definitions. You can see that in our old project we have two menus defined, one for the friends entities and also ones for the mentions entity types. So let's go ahead and begin now by first we'll delete the mentions. We don't need that anymore, and we want to change this one from friends to Twitter. And next we want to go ahead and change these menu items and make them relevant to our desired functionality. So I'll do that. I'll add in, or I'll change this caption for the new, and I'll also change the URL element and paste in some JavaScript that will open up the Twitter entry dialog. It'll do this, and then also in the query string I'll be specifying the tweet ID is 0 and the tweet name is 0. So this is going to reset the tweet current. Next, I'll add in a new menu item in order to retweet an existing Twitter tweet in the archive control. This is the action we'll take when we right-click and choose Retweet from the context menu, or click on the Retweet button in the archive controls toolbar. The added functionality in this URL element in this JavaScript is simply this query string, which specifies tweet type equals retweet. We also see another way to define our archive control in the menu definition using the replacement tag nomenclature we talked about in previous videos. So essentially you can hardwire or hard code the name of the control followed by archive control, and then the refresh list method will go ahead and refresh the archive control list as a callback method. So here's just using the replacement tag nomenclature that will go ahead and type this in for us. Next, we want to add in a new menu item, and this is going to be to reply to a selected tweet that's selected in the archive control. For this JavaScript action, the only thing that's different from the previous ones is that here the tweet type equals reply. We'll also add in another one, and this one will be to reference a message that's currently selected. And this tweet type equals reference. All of these tweet types are actually defined as an enumeration in our definite.twitter library. It's used by the data handler in order to execute a specific action, and we'll take a close look at that towards the end of this video. Next, we want to navigate over to the SOArchive control link info types and define what we want to happen when we single click or double click a row in the archive control. We already have one here defined for friends, but again we want to link this up to the entity's Twitter now, because we've changed it in the archive provider, we've changed it in the context menu definition, and now we're going to change it in the row click definition for the link infos. So let's go ahead and just change the name of this to Twitter for the click operation, and that's simply going to reset the current equal to the currently selected record. It'll set the tweet ID as well as the tweet name, which will be the Twitter ID when we select a row in the archive control. Next, we want to define a double click action. So we're going to add in a new link info element here, specify it also as type Twitter, specify the subtype as double click, and now we're going to call the dialog open method to open up the Twitter entry dialog. And you can see that I'm going to be specifying the tweet ID equal to the currently selected row, but I don't want this actually to work this way. I actually want to reset the current so that it opens up the tweet dialog and ready for me to submit a new tweet to Twitter. This is the same type of behavior that is if I was to double click on the activities archive control in the diary view. It's going to open up a new appointment dialog ready for me to create a new appointment from scratch. And that's the same type of behavior I want to happen here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to change some of this and say, okay, tweet name and tweet ID equals 0. That's essentially going to reset the current. And then after the dialog closes, we'll call this callback method, which will refresh the archive control. Great, so we'll save all these changes. And next, we want to actually go to the SO Twitter page and begin to define some toolbar buttons. So we have one toolbar button defined here, and that's the add toolbar button. The JavaScript method simply says add something. So let's go ahead and change that. What we're going to do now is the same as we did in our context menu definitions, is we're going to take that code, we're going to call dialog open up the Twitter entry dialog, and we'll reset the current to 0, ready for us to create a new tweet. Next, we'll add in the second button for retweet capability, on the onClick method, exactly like it did in the subcontext menu, we're going to go ahead and just set the tweet type to retweet, and then have the callback fire after. For the next few buttons, we'll go ahead and add those in. It's going to be the exact same code for reply as the context menu. The JavaScript action is dialog open. And you'll see that these are all the same. Tweet type equals reply, tweet type equals direct, and lastly, tweet type equals reference. As long as I save all changes, and because I made changes to the SO archive control link info types, I'm actually going to have to go ahead and do an IIS reset. That's the only file that we've changed that requires an IIS reset. We've also recompiled the DLL and redeployed it to the website's bin directory. That will require us to log back into the application. So now if we go back to the application, I'll go ahead and refresh this page, which will then kick me back to the login screen, and I'll have to log back in. So let's go ahead and do that now. Great, so here we are. We now see, if I right click on this row, we'll see that we do have the right context menu. If we look down at the toolbar buttons, we have the right toolbar buttons that we expect. And to really test this, we'll go ahead and click on retweet and ensure that the tweet dialog appears ready to retweet the selected message, and in fact it does. To see the other behaviors that occur in this context menu, if I click on reply, what we should see is the tweet dialog appear with simply the username who submitted this tweet in the dialog text box, ready for me to send him a message with the asterisk in front of his name so that it will be addressed to him. Okay. So that works as expected. If I right click and I choose send him a direct message, that will go ahead and put in the prefix necessary to send this individual a direct message. So how is all of this happening? Well, it's happening in the data handler actually. Remember, we're setting the query string tweet type variable to a specific value equal to that of the action we want to take, whether it's retweet, reply, direct message, or reference message. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that works inside the data handler. The very first thing that happens when any page that depends on this data handler is invoked, the initialize method is called. And you remember in our config section of our data handler we defined our settings necessary in order to gain access to where we store our Twitter credentials in the database. We'll go ahead and add the credentials entity to the data carrier collection. The next thing that happens is when whatever dialog that's being loaded, for example, we have the Twitter entry dialog page that's being loaded, when we invoke this JavaScript that says dialog open Twitter entry dialog, and then we're specifying a query string here, tweet type equals retweet. Okay. So that will then call the Twitter entity dialog page, and this will begin to load, which is when the initialize method is going to be called, and then these settings will specify where to get the credentials from the database. The rest of the panels, cars, and views will continue to be parsed and loaded, and once we get down here to the text box, we've set a data source saying entity data handler, which is our Twitter data handler, access the Twitter entity in the data carriers collection, which is our Twitter carrier, and then get this value from that property and populate this text control with it. Okay, so Twitter entity here is what's being accessed, and so if we go back to the data handler, the load method is going to be called in order to load that carrier. So here we're going to look and we're going to say, okay, does this carrier ID equal Twitter entity. It's actually just the string for that Twitter carrier. So then I'm going to call set carriers, and I'm going to pass in the credentials carrier, which I need to get the credentials from the database to get tweets and save tweets to the Twitter web service. And I'll specify the second parameter to actually load the state. Down here I'm going to use this Twitter helper class that will help me get the Twitter carrier and populate that in my data carriers collection. It's here inside the get Twitter carrier method that you can begin to see me inspect those query strings. The first thing I'm going to do is instantiate a bare bones Twitter carrier, and then I'm going to check to ensure that we have the stored credentials in the database for the currently logged on user. If I do, then I'll go ahead and populate the username and password for that carrier collection, for the credentials carrier. If I want to load state, then I'll go ahead and I'll say load Twitter state. And this is where we begin to see me inspect the query string. And then I'm going to check if that query string exists, and if it does, then I know I want to act on the selected row of an existing tweet. So I'm going to say, okay, load that tweet. I'm going to get the tweet type. I'll pass in the credentials carrier as well as the Twitter carrier. The get tweet type method here is actually peeling into the query string and getting the value. Then it's going to return that as a tweet type. As you can see, gets the current again, and then populates the status value for this Twitter carrier. This status value is calling here into this method get Twitter status, which will actually get the Twitter status data type defined in the TweetSharp library. Okay, so here when I load the tweet, then it's going to go ahead and call get tweet text, which will populate the status text. And get tweet text looks at that tweet type that was pulled out of the query string and defines what the prefix will be in the ultimately the text that will be displayed in the text box. Whether or not it will be like retweet as well as the entire message, or will it be like a reply to and just the screen name to a message to the user, or a direct message or a reference message. Now ideally I could have used the Twitter library a little bit better than I have. So the TweetSharp library does support retweet messages, replying to an existing message as well as direct messages, but I chose not to use that API just to make it a little bit simpler for this demonstration. You can go ahead and refactor this application in order to leverage that, but for the sake of simplicity I just hard-coded those values in. So now if we go back to the data handler, we'll see that okay, we're going to set the carrier, and then we'll just blow past the load method, and the dialog will appear, and the text value will be pulled from the status and populate the SO text box control. When we submit a new tweet or retweet or do a direct message, etc., we'll go ahead and click on the save button on that Twitter entry dialog page. That's going to go ahead and invoke the save method inside the data handler. So for this operation, we'll pull out the credentials carrier in order to get the credentials from the database. We'll go ahead and ensure that those credentials exist, and then we're going to make sure that this entry, there is in fact a Twitter entry to submit to the Twitter web service. So we'll pull that out of the data carrier collection, and we'll use the Twitter helper in order to persist this tweet. So that pretty much completes all of the operations necessary in order to make all of this work inside 6.web. My hope is that you've learned enough in this video series to become productive with your 6.web development needs. Please feel free to email me some feedback, and I'll try and follow up with any questions with more and better videos that demonstrate the extensibility of the platform. Until then, happy coding!